Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Dan Alter. I'm the Learning and Engagement Coordinator at the Magnes Collection of Jewish Art and Life. If you're new to the Magnes, welcome. We're delighted you're here tonight. And if you're returning, thank you for your ongoing support and engagement. The Magnes is a museum dedicated to generating new knowledge and understanding of Jewish cultures from around the world, which we do through exhibitions and programs drawn from and connected to the approximately 60,000 objects, artworks, images, and documents in our care. We frequently work in collaboration with community and campus partners, as we are doing this evening. And we are delighted to partner with the UC Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies on tonight's event. And without further ado, I'm going to invite Ethan Katz, the faculty director of the Center for Jewish Studies, to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Dan. And thank you so much to the Magnes for hosting us, as always. It's a wonderful partnership. The Magnes and the Center for Jewish Studies are co-hosts, so to speak, for tonight's event. And we're also really pleased to have co-sponsorship from the History Department and the German Department. As Dan said, my name is Ethan Katz. I direct the Center for Jewish Studies, and it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you all to tonight's event, in particular for an exciting talk about the new book of my dear colleague and friend, John Efron. John Efron is the Cord Professor of Jewish History here at UC Berkeley, where he's taught for the past 25 years. Well before he came to Berkeley, well before I came to Berkeley about 7 years ago, John was already a legendary figure in the fields of Jewish history, and particularly the history of Jews in Germany. And I really think he's one of the most prodigious, creative, and insightful scholars of those fields. And that's among the reasons that I'm really excited to read his new book and encourage you all to consider purchasing it afterwards. I'm told that he will be happy to sign it for you if you ask him nicely. And maybe even if you don't. I'm going to say a little bit about John's intellectual biography. So John grew up in Melbourne, Australia, where he also did his undergraduate degree at Monash University. He then came to the United States and did his MA at NYU and then his PhD at Columbia University in Jewish history under the tutelage of the legendary Jewish historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi and Nancy Stepan, a noted historian of science. There he wrote a dissertation that became his first book entitled Defenders of the Race, Jewish Doctors in Race Science in Fin de Siècle Europe, published by Yale University Press in 1994. And this book established John as a leading scholar of the history of anti-Semitism, German Jewry, and Jews in modern science. Whereas scholars had previously treated late 19th century race science as a story in which Jews were only passive victims and had traced ideas about racialized minorities pushing back on sort of hegemonic anthropological ideas of race to a much later time, to the era of decolonization, John really effectively rewrote this story. He showed in his book that already in the late 19th century, Jews had themselves been involved in race science and had engaged in the field as a way to assert a positive racialized Jewish identity in the face of rising racial anti-Semitism. This book was really on the crest of a wave of interest in Jews and race and did a lot to pioneer and push forward that conversation. It also established John as, to my mind, one of the most creative Jewish historians of his generation. I say that because, one of the things I think John has a knack for is finding topics that people would not necessarily conventionally pull off the shelf or put together. Now, the idea that race science would be a story about Jews asserting a positive identity and agency is not one that would be obvious to most people. And John made a similarly original pairing in his second book, in his second monograph entitled Medicine and the German Jews, A History, published by Yale in 2001. And this book also showed John's tremendous longitudinal range chronologically, because he traced the history of German Jewish engagements with medicine from the medieval era all the way to the 20th century. And he chose, I think, in a very apt way to focus on not just sort of some laundry list of Jewish doctors or every time that Jews interacted with medicine, but to think about where Jewishness was significant to the German Jewish encounter with medicine, both in terms of Jews becoming doctors and contributing to medicine and being involved in medicine, but also in terms of German ideas about Jews and medicine that were often quite negative and anti-Semitic. Here again, he showed his facility with the integration of the history of science and Jewish history in a way that has been rare among Jewish historians before and since, and showed this kind of overall mastery of Jewish history, which is a characteristic of all his work, and is maybe one of the reasons that he then became the co-author of what is now widely recognized as sort of the textbook in the history of Jews. It's called The Jews, A History. It was done with Matthias Lehmann and Stephen Weitzman and published first by Prentice Hall in 2009, and then subsequently in several new editions, most recently through Routledge. And I have to say, like when I was in graduate school, we would have these whole seminars about, was there a decent textbook in Jewish history? What was the best one, or what was the least bad one? I don't think they have seminars like that anymore, because this textbook has become the gold standard. So it's a pleasure to be right down the hall from one of the co-authors when I have various questions about Jewish studies and Jewish history. And by the time I was applying to work at Berkeley, John had just completed his prior most recent book, German Jewry and the Allure of the Sephardic, published by Princeton in 2016. And this was a book that traced a subject that was somewhat known but had never really been examined in great detail, which was this somewhat odd engagement of German Jews in the 19th century in the era of emancipation with Sephardic literature, Sephardic art, Sephardic history, particularly of the Jews of medieval Spain as a kind of ideal model for themselves. And John, I think, made a very persuasive argument using W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness to help understand this as a way that these Jews tried to engage both with a piece of their Jewish identity and with a deep sense of assertion of modern German identity. And he also made a novel argument there about Orientalism, pushing back on the work of Edward Said. And one of the big takeaways from that book, which John helpfully has reminded me of in a number of conversations since that time, is just that we think about the lands of Jews in Muslim lands, the areas where Jews lived in Arab lands as the Orient, from the notion of Orientalism that became sort of very in fashion in the academy some 40 years ago. And in Jewish history, those who were considered Oriental were often really the Eastern European Jews, and that in fact the German Jews in the 19th and early 20th century had idealized the Jews of Arab lands as the most sophisticated, the least backward, the most educated, and saw the backwardness in Eastern Europe. And I point this out. It was a very interesting and important argument, but it also, I think, was a reminder that John has repeatedly taken Jewish history as a way to rethink big questions, and basically pointed out, if you look at this question from the standpoint of what was actually going on with Jewish history, it doesn't look nearly so simple as we might have thought. His new book that we're hearing about tonight, All-Consuming German Jews and the Meaning of Meat, another creative venture into the archive to illuminate a subject that few of us would formulate, and that also shows great longitudinal range. And I'm looking forward to hearing about it in a moment. I'm just going to say a word about John as my colleague and friend. So John and I are a little bit like salt and pepper, okay? We're complementary, but we're rather different in some ways. But when we get together, things get really interesting. John sometimes sees me as a blind optimist. I might once in a while think that John is a bit pessimistic. John might see me as overly generous in my assessment of scholarly work. I might find John a bit critical in his reactions at times. But really the word that I would use to describe John in many respects is exacting, right? And I really mean that in a very positive sense. When I was a candidate here, John kept telling me, you're having a million meetings with people, they're putting you through your paces, right? And I think that's actually what John does with everything that he encounters in the intellectual and scholarly realm, is he really puts it through his paces, and that's a serious level of rigor. And as a colleague, what that has done for me is it's often been a humbling experience, talking to John about an issue that I thought I understood relatively well and realized that I actually didn't. But it's really made me a more careful and exacting and thoughtful scholar. And John always brings that exactitude with a spirit of camaraderie and good cheer and a lot of humor, which I also deeply appreciated. So it's a great pleasure to introduce John, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about his new book.
Thank you, Ethan, for reminding me what I've written, because I've forgotten. Okay. Just bear with me for a second here. So let me begin with two questions. Why write a book about meat? And why write a book about the way Germans and Jews have perceived the meat of each other, and in turn perceived each other through their respective meats? As to the first question, put simply, meat is very important. Its consumption occasioned the first great diet change in hominins about 2.6 million years ago, and with Homo erectus it played a crucial role in human development from a physiological, social and cultural point of view. Meat has, to greater and lesser extents, been a central part of the diet of most humans throughout history. Beyond being a source of nourishment, all food, but especially meat, is rich in meanings and symbols. Indeed, whether consumed or avoided, meat carries with it particularly potent connotations, both positive and negative. It can engender delight, as easily as it can evoke feelings of dread. Indeed, meat might be said to be a mode of ordering the world. It represents a moral, ethical, religious, ritualistic, aesthetic, gustatory, communicative, artistic, and linguistic network of ideas, practices, and attitudes. Now, many cultures have rules about who may eat meat and when, which parts may be consumed, and in what order certain parts must be eaten. Some cultures abhor meat, while others refuse some meats, but not all meat. Whatever the case, meat is universally significant. In the words of the anthropologist Mary Douglas, humans and nature are always confronting each other face to face, but never more so than at the division of the meat. In Judaism, meat is of paramount importance, for it constitutes the very focal point of the dietary laws and serves as one of the most visible markers of Jewish distinctness and social separation. It is an object of tangible, touchable, and tastable difference like no other. And now to my second question, why write a book about the way Germans and Jews have perceived each other's meats? And the reason is as follows. I contend that from the Middle Ages until today, the meaning of meat in Germany as both an object of totem and taboo has played a crucial role in interactions between Christians and Jews, as well as among Jews. Germany offers a particularly rich backdrop against which to view the contested culture of meat and its role in the formation of ethnic identities, both German and Jewish. To an extent not seen anywhere else in Europe, in art, text, law, scholarship, politics, commerce, and popular culture, Germans have identified, thought about, studied, decried, and gladly eaten the meat of the Jews. Likewise, Jews in Germany thought about, studied, sometimes decried, and vigorously defended their meats and the culture and rituals surrounding them by educating Germans and Jews alike about their meaning and relevance. Now, look, this is a story of very long duration. It goes from the Middle Ages, the book goes from the Middle Ages till the 20th century anyway. And I can't possibly cover all that in the time that I have this evening with you. So what I'll do is focus on the modern period, so from the 18th to the 20th centuries. That's long enough. And to tell our story, I've identified 3 themes which illustrate the intersection of meat and national or ethnic identity, all of which are specific to Germany. So the first theme that I'll look at is meat and citizenship. And second, meat and bourgeois culture, Jewish bourgeois culture, and finally, politics and the meat of the Jews. And when taken together, these themes represent a substantial, though by no means exhaustive, account of the story of Germans, Jews, and the meaning of meat. From the Middle Ages through the modern period, the discourse around Christian views of Jewish meat and Jewish views of Christian meat were quite naturally deeply informed by religion in both negative and positive ways. In short, both parties were horrified by the meat of the other. However, meat was a source and symbol of the Jewish-Christian divide. While it was that, it also possessed the power, the singular power, to bring both parties together in an act of economic codependency and, ironically, courtesy of the Jewish dietary laws themselves. How so? Christians bought and still buy and eat those parts of animals that Jews eat, but which are not kosher. And for example, the rump of a cow, unless it has been purged of the sciatic nerve, and certain forbidden fats, which are called chelev. Because Jews you can't discard a third of a cow. The medieval church's admonitions against Christians eating Jewish meat were honoured in the breach because the arrangement was mutually advantageous to Jewish butchers and Christian customers. However, by the 18th century, or beginning in the 18th century, the German discourse about meat took a more secular, let's say, cultural turn. At that time, the deplorable social and economic condition of German Jewry led some thinkers to begin re-evaluating the relationship of Jews to the German state. They asked a series of questions. Among them, was it possible for the Jews to be Europeanized? Did their customs befit the modern age? Did any of their religious practices preclude social integration? And finally, could the Jews be emancipated and granted German citizenship? To these questions, there were answers in both the negative and affirmative. But unique among all countries where Jewish emancipation was debated, meat was frequently central to the discourse in Germany, as it would continue to be into the 20th century. Because of the strong anthropological element in the emancipation discourse, some Germans focused on the diet of the Jews and considered it an insurmountable barrier to social integration. Johann David Michaelis was a renowned 18th century scholar of Hebrew Bible and professor of Oriental languages at the University of Göttingen. He was also a dogged opponent of Jewish emancipation. Michaelis was convinced that by continuing to practice customs born in the ancient Near East, the Jews remained an Oriental people, and nothing so clearly demonstrated their unfitness for German citizenship as did their relationship to meat. In 1782, he claimed that the law of Moses was intended to maintain the separateness of the Jews. As long as they refuse to eat together with us and to form sincere friendship at table, they will never become fully integrated, he wrote. Notably, this even applied to those Jews who had abandoned the dietary laws, because for having done so, Michaelis said he could not trust them. When I see a Jew eating pork, in order, no doubt, to offend his religion, then I find it impossible to rely on his word because I cannot understand his heart. Jews, he argued, could not be made citizens because their meat would prevent them from fulfilling the most important duty of a citizen, taking up arms to defend Germany. As long as the Jews observed the laws about kosher and non-kosher food, it will be almost impossible to integrate them into our ranks. So in short, if the Jews abandon their dietary laws and consume pork, they are not to be trusted. If they persevere in observing those same laws, they seek to remain separate from the majority and cannot be relied upon to defend Germany. And this is sort of the sort of thing that he was talking about. This is from the community of Fürth in the south of Germany, and this is the abattoir that's in the courtyard of the Jewish community. And we have, it gives us this is a book written by Paul Christian Kerner, who had been a rabbi and had converted. And after his conversion, which was in about 1715, he published this book, Jewish Ceremonies. And we have a very good sense of the community at work here, including not just the shochet here and his helpers, most of whom do not conform to the stereotype of the Jew. They're muscular, they're working with cows, they're strong. And here is the bodek, who's the person whose arm is up to his shoulder inside the cow, swimming around inside the cow to check that there are no lesions or there is no disease. And we see people sort of chatting away very amiably. Two Jews are back here, and they're discussing a piece of meat that one of them is holding. And there is one woman in the back just here, and there she is, and there's a fire coming in from the oven, and there's a basket here, or a bucket, in which there is meat that she is koshering, that she's rendering kosher. And from the same period, this is a chalaf, and this is the knife that's used to slaughter, and it's from the 18th century Germany. Okay, so 1782, that's where I was. 3 years later, in 1785, Michaelis published the 4th volume of his monumental work, Mosaic Law. In his extended commentary on the Jewish dietary laws, Michaelis claimed that they were an invention of the Jews and thus an expression of national identity, not religious devotion. While the foodways of Europeans were also expressions of national identity, they were, he said, maintained as mere likes and dislikes. No people had drafted an entire national gastronomic constitution. Only the Jews had done that. Not only was it impossible to eat and drink with them, he said, we Jews and Germans have developed a learned disgust, Erziehungsabscheu, for the food of the other. And this is an obstacle to fostering closer familiarity. Referring to the ribboned rosettes that soldiers in his day wore as an identifying mark, the dietary laws were, quite simply, he said, a cockade for the Israelites. Thus we come full circle. Jews qua Jews could not serve in the Prussian army, and this is because, armed with their dietary laws, they had already formed an army of their own. When you leave the building on the left-hand side in the glass case, you will see this bowl. And it's a bowl that is from Germany, it's from pewter, and it has in Hebrew basar yom tov, meaning that it is meat to be served on a Jewish holiday. The implacable anti-Semite Hartwig Hund-Radowski, at around this time, said as follows, I'm just reading the quote here, a religion should concern itself with the spirit and the heart and not with the stomach and pots and pans. And this precisely illustrates exactly what he had to say. Like Michaelis, Christoph Magnes was a professor in the School of History at Göttingen. In a discussion of Moses' division of animals into the categories of clean and unclean, Magnes elided ancient Israelites and modern Jews in a most seamless fashion. He would not be the only one to do so. Moses, he observed, forbade the Jews from eating many animals or parts of animals, deeming them unclean, but which were, without question, healthier than the goose and goose fat which Jews in such great numbers enjoy today. Worst of all, their dietary self-segregation manifested itself in the Jews' refusal to eat pork, Germany's Lieblingsfleisch, its favourite meat. It was, he suggested, tantamount to a rejection of the Germans themselves. Jews in Germany were also concerned about their meat and its relationship to citizenship and social integration. In the 19th century, this followed two tracks. The first ran along the lines of debating whether the dietary laws remained relevant, a subject of particular concern and significance for Reform Judaism. There were voices pro and con. Perhaps even more heated was the subject of temple sacrifice, which, after all, is about meat. Both the newly founded Reform and Neo-Orthodox streams took up the matter. Given the slow and uneven process of emancipation in Germany, Jews made repeated and strenuous efforts to modernize Jewish culture, with many believing that the synagogue had a central role to play in the cultural transformation of the Jews. If that was to be the case, a particularly thorny issue was the liturgy, specifically the prayer of Musaf, which is the additional service recited on Shabbat and on the holidays and Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. Musaf commemorates the additional sacrifices that were offered in the ancient temple of Jerusalem on those days. In its various versions, Musaf calls for the return of the Jews to their ancestral homeland, reconstruction of the temple, and the restoration of animal sacrifice. In the very first Reform prayer book, introduced at the very first Reform temple in Hamburg in 1818, the Musaf was replaced with a petition that prayer be accepted instead of sacrifice. May it be your will, O Lord our God and God of our fathers, to receive in mercy and favour the expression of our lips in place of the obligatory sacrifices. There were those who were satisfied with the innovation at Hamburg, while others suggested alternate solutions. One was to declare that, quote, our spirit surrenders to God, it soars without mediation towards the Spirit of God. Another proposal recommended saying Musaf, but silently, while yet another suggested that the prayer could be said aloud, but only in Hebrew, perhaps in recognition of the fact that neither Germans nor most of the congregates could understand it. As for Neo-Orthodoxy, it would not countenance any change in the liturgy. However, like Reform Jews, the Neo-Orthodox were also imbued with the values of the Enlightenment and middle-class German culture. This meant that, like Reform, Neo-Orthodoxy could not petition for the return of animal sacrifice. To do so would have been barbaric, undermining the quest for citizenship. The leading figure of Neo-Orthodoxy was Samson Raphael Hirsch. His response to the dilemma of retaining Musaf while rejecting sacrifice was to explain sacrifice as being part of a symbolic system and not a literal, potentially living practice. The ability, he writes, to express ideas by physically perceptible signs or symbols is as natural and as necessary to man as are the ability and the urge to communicate ideas by means of spoken, audible words. Sacrifice was precisely one of those physically perceptible signs, and because the ideas behind Judaism's symbols were eternally binding, the idea of sacrifice remained as relevant in Hirsch's day as it was when the temple still stood. Christians, too, sought to take account of animal sacrifice in ancient Israel. Beginning in the 18th century and developing over the course of the 19th century, Protestant scholars in Germany founded the modern academic field of biblical criticism. The towering figure of this enterprise was Julius Wellhausen. He was concerned with the authorship and compilation of the Hebrew Bible, and argued that the Pentateuch had its origins in 4 separate texts that he dated to several centuries after the time of Moses. His historicization of Judaism led him to argue that instead of being a creation of Israelite religion in its earliest phase, the ceremonial law by which he meant animal sacrifice was a very late development. As such, Judaism did not follow a normative evolutionary pattern, that is to say, beginning in primitive fashion and later evolving into a humane, ethically guided religious culture. He concluded that Judaism was, and I quote, an irregular product of history. The ideal of holiness governs the whole of life by means of a net of ceremonies and observances which separate the Jew from the natural man. Wellhausen was a Protestant supersessionist and a German nationalist who believed in Israel's radically distinctive identity, national identity. His claim that Israel had abandoned prophetic ethics in favor of the late adoption of a priestly cult centered on animal sacrifice must be seen against the backdrop of the larger contemporary debate over national identities in modern Germany. The second category that I want to look at is meat and bourgeois culture. And here we will get to talk about meat proper. After being legally emancipated in 1871, German Jewry sought to acculturate but not assimilate, a process that concludes with disappearance. In Germany, resistance to disappearing came courtesy of religion, intra-marriage, class and profession-based affinity, and anti-Semitism. However, if the resistance movement had a headquarters, a place where it could hunker down and fend off the forces of assimilation, it was the home kitchen. There, the Jewish diet, linked as it was to the Jewish calendar, was an important component of what it meant to be a German Jew. That diet tells us much about Jewish social and economic advancement, as well as Jewish bourgeois tastes and culture. Over the course of the 19th century, German meat consumption tripled, and by 1910, Germans ate on average 114 pounds per annum. 65% of all the meat consumed in Germany was pork. While there are no statistics for Jews, it's safe to surmise that the total meat consumption by Jews in Germany would have looked very much like the national average, except, of course, for the pork consumption. As such, by the 19th century, meat was central to German Jewish cookery and identity. Now, there are numerous sources that we can turn to in different genres that allow us to make such a claim. The first would be odes to German Jewish cuisine by authors who memorialized their most beloved meat dishes. Second, early 20th century Jewish scholarship in Germany, which created the field of food ethnography, history, and folklore. And third, kosher cookbooks. So let's look at just two of these, the odes and the cookbooks. The poet and writer Heinrich Heine was a passionate devotee of Ashkenazic cuisine. In particular, a dish that German Jews called Charlotte, and maybe better known to you as Chulent, like a cassoulet, about which he waxed rhapsodic. In his epic poem, Princess Sabbath, the miserable experience of the Jewish peddler's week, wherein he had been treated like a dog, sees him transformed by the arrival of the Sabbath and the Charlotte, so integral to the peddler's revival. Charlotte is the food of heaven, and the recipe was given by the Lord himself to Moses one fine day upon Mount Sinai. On the very spot where likewise God revealed his moral doctrines and the holy 10 Commandments, in the midst of flames and lightning, Charlotte is God's bread of rapture. It is the kosher ambrosia that is catered straight from heaven. And compared with such a morsel, the ambrosia of the pagan pseudo-gods of ancient Hellas, who were devils in disguise, was just a pile of devil's dreck. Heine's expression of culinary nationalism was more than matched by his contemporary and far less well-known, Moritz Gottlieb Safir. Safir was born near Budapest and educated first at renowned yeshivas in Pressburg and in Prague. In his early teens, he was exposed to secular culture, studied European literature, and learned English, German, and Romance languages. Like Heine, Safir loved Jewish food, and like Heine, he wrote of that love. In 1847, His essay, The Gastronomy of the Jews, or Vogel's Restaurant, Recollections of My Youth, appeared in 2 installments in The Humorist, the Viennese satirical daily that he had founded in 1837. It's a bitingly funny essay, and Safir tells us that Vogel's Restaurant, quote, awoke in my stomach the memories of youth, which are called cravings, and those cravings for the flesh pots of Europe were in my stomach dreams of cholent and kugel. Cholent, he said, was more than a Sabbath dish. It represented a system. In fact, cholent is like the fate of the Jew. Citizenship is not conferred by a cookbook, and it doesn't go with other dishes. Rolled by fate like barley, like peas gnawed by every worm, like dried meat hung in the chimney of the zeitgeist. On the whole, bold, abundant, and poignant. In addition to their mutual love of cholent, Heine and Safir also shared another sentiment. Both men derided modern Jews, preferring instead what Safir called Stockjuden, traditional Jews. The traditional Jew, wrote Safir, is candid. He stands up straight and says, I am a Jew, while only the modern Jews bow and scrape, bending this way and that, switching sides if one way doesn't suit or is too uncomfortable. Safir wrote this some 17 years after he had converted to Protestantism, and a mere 5 years after Heine had done the same thing. He writes self-consciously about his conversion and its relation to his ongoing desire for Jewish food. Jewish national foods. To comprehend them, one must be a scholar. To describe them, a genius. And to enjoy them with a benediction, a Jew. But to honor them, one must be a Meshumed, a convert. To prove the point, Safir became one of his favorite foods, and thus he declared, a bastard born of cholent, namely the kugel, is the ganef. Now just let me explain. The cholent in German Jewish cuisine is not a separate side dish as it sort of is in the United States. It was something that was central to the cholent pot itself. Right? It was sort of a mass of flour, and then it's baked in with the cholent. So you have to understand that. Now he called the kugel a ganef. The ganef is not a term of his. It's not an invention of his. It's not. The term was commonly used by German Jews to describe what he said was, quote, an ennobled kugel, when it is united with the aroma of cholent. The kugel as epos, an epic poem. The ganef is a thief. It is called a ganef because in its gestalt, a raw mass of flour in the middle of a sealed pot of rice, beans, goose breast, goose liver, and other delicacies, it steals the aroma and taste of everything else around it in order to make itself its own. And then, he says, as a transformed mensch, endowed with all of its foreign characteristics, it emerges alive from the pot. Safir is the ganef he celebrates, or perhaps eulogizes. He started out as a bland, unformed mass and then took on, or did he steal, like a ganef, non-Jewish culture and all the qualities and characteristics that made him who he had become? A convert, to be sure, but still never more Jewish than when in the cholent pot. Where Bildung is the German word for self-cultivation through education, the 19th century memorialization of and instruction in how to prepare Jewish foods was a form of culinary Bildung. Kosher cookbooks, and Germany was the first country to publish them, served as guides to the acquisition of a new Jewish culinary self-awareness. Almost exclusively written by women, they were a new Jewish literary genre. They had become especially popular between 1850 and 1910, and while not all the recipes were intended for daily fare, because many of them were just far too elaborate, the cookbooks reveal an ideal, a goal that a respectable middle-class Jewish family should strive for, and as such they are really very valuable historical sources. German Jewish cookbooks were ostentatiously large. The smallest such volume contained some 300 recipes, while the largest, Marie Elsasser's detailed cookbook for basic and refined Jewish cooking, had a massive 3,759 recipes. The plenitude of the German Jewish table depicted in these cookbooks was reflective and symbolic of lives no longer lived on the margins. In their own way, they were an homage to the land of plenty in which German Jews lived. More than this, sometimes they were apologia. Philip Muntz, a physician and a scion of a distinguished family of Orthodox rabbis, published 2 substantial essays in leading medical journals on the therapeutic advantages of the dietary laws. Long and technical, both essays, nevertheless, served as the foreword to Berta Gumbrich's complete practical cookbook of Jewish cuisine, Germany's most popular Jewish cookbook. The essays appeared in every edition from the first in 1888 to the last in 1925. One of the earliest cookbooks, we do not know the author's name, appeared in Vienna in 1854. It was entitled A New and Complete Cookbook of Jewish Cuisine. It has the distinction of being the world's first published Yiddish cookbook. Being in Yiddish did not mean that this anonymous cookbook wasn't aimed at middle-class Jewish women. It surely was. For this we have visual evidence in the form of the book's frontispiece, with its illustration of 2 obviously bourgeois women cooking together, most likely a mother and daughter, as indicated in the book's title. In the foreground, you'll see just there, the daughter holds an open weave metal grate over a fire as she grills liver to make it kosher. It's of note that there were still significant numbers of middle-class Jewish women in 19th century Vienna who were more comfortable reading the Hebrew alphabet than they were the Latin alphabet. Appearing in 1851, Rebecca Wolf's Cookbook for Jewish Women was a bestseller and appeared in 14 editions, the last one published in Frankfurt in 1933. Many of her dishes are standard Ashkenazic fare, and so it's noteworthy that despite the vast cultural and socio-economic gulf that had opened up between Eastern European and German Jews, one could find different versions of the same traditional dishes at the Sabbath or Passover tables of Jews in Koblenz and Krakow, Mannheim and Minsk, Berlin and Brody. All the German Jewish cookbooks had meat recipes that were likewise eaten by Jews further east. That said, the foods were not identical. Eastern European Jews were unlikely to prepare a dish called rabbit from mincemeat, even if it was just a meatloaf made from kosher beef and molded into the shape of a rabbit. Nor would they be eating mock turtle soup. Eastern European Jews were unlikely to eat foods with names such as goose liver à la Strasbourg, kidneys in Madeira sauce, bœuf à la mode, or tongue in Bordeaux wine. In Germany, the general view of French cooking was that it was superior and came with an approbation by virtue of its place of origin. To prepare something French style was part of the acquisition and practice of culinary Bildung, as well as an expression of bourgeois cosmopolitanism. Another point of difference from Jewish cooking further east is that 19th century meat recipes in German Jewish cookbooks have echoes of medieval cooking techniques. Now, a typical French cooking method of serving food at court in the Middle Ages involved the elaborate process of deconstructing, stuffing, and reconstructing an animal, and then presenting at a table in a most elaborate and colourful display. In Berta Gumbrich's complete practical cookbook of Jewish cuisine, her recipe for turkey in aspic, or in her Germano-Gallic rendering, Truthahn à la gelatine, was just such a dish. The instructions tell the reader that after the turkey has been made kosher, it is to be spatchcocked, that is, cut from head to tail along its back. And when the entire carcass is exposed, the bird is to be deboned. Wings, legs, and all the flesh must remain in one piece. The boneless carcass is then to be stuffed with a forcemeat of minced veal, beef, heart, liver, shallots and onions, salt, pepper, nutmeg, eggs, pickled cucumbers, truffles, turnips, pistachios, and olives. The whole turkey is then to be sewn, trussed, and bound between 2 boards. which are then lowered into a very large warm water bath to poach gently. When done, the fire is to be turned off and the turkey allowed to sit in the water until it is cooled. It is then to be removed and decorated with the aspic that had formed, the jelly, that had formed during the cooking process. The aspic is then dyed in various colours and cut into strips and placed all over the turkey to simulate its feathering. Spectacular and historically rich turkey in aspic is to be served either with a fruit compote or a mustard sauce. Gombrich's cookbook exemplifies just how central meat was to the German Jewish diet. In the 9th edition that appeared in 1925, there are, and I've counted them, there are a staggering 61 beef, 41 veal, 10 lamb and 24 poultry dishes. In addition, there are 58 soup recipes with either a meat-derived soup base or a broth made using some kind of animal fat. Similarly, 79 of her vegetable dishes were made with meat, and in a separate section dedicated to potato recipes, 19 of them were made with meat or animal fat. Even her desserts, such as her Passover recipe for apple cake, called for 2 tablespoons of fat to be taken from the chicken soup, or Guschmalz. My third and final category is politics and the meat of the Jews. In the 19th century, the meat of the Jews became political fodder in Germany. Across Europe and the United States, meat went from being a luxury to a staple. And in response, new vegetarian societies popped up everywhere. Uniquely, vegetarianism in Germany was also part of a much larger movement, one that recoiled at the perceived excesses of the bourgeoisie and its prodigious meat consumption. A loose collection of teetotalers, anti-smokers, clothing reformers, advocates of organic farming and naturopathic medicine, nudists, anti-vaccination and anti-vivisection campaigners, vegetarians, hiking groups, and adherents of Eastern spirituality all came together to form a vibrant social movement known as Lebensreform, or life reform. The movement was not the domain of any one class and attracted members from across the social and religious spectrum. However, one strain of the life reform movement was its implacably anti-Semitic wing. Committed to vegetarianism, it followed the philosopher Schopenhauer, who in his essay On the Basis of Morality of 1840 denounced those who, quote, pretended that beasts have no rights, that we have no duties towards animals, a doctrine revolting, gross, and barbarous, peculiar to the West, and which has its roots in Judaism. Among the adherents to this line of thought was the influential Bayreuth circle gathered around their hero, the composer Richard Wagner, who Hitler would later credit with being the inspiration for his own vegetarianism. It was in this cultural climate of an unholy alliance of animal protection societies and anti-Semitic political parties that they prosecuted a relentless campaign to ban kosher slaughter, which forbids stunning right before the animal is killed. It was decried as a cruel, inhumane, and typically bloodthirsty rite. Jews were even accused of taking special delight in the cruel killing of animals. And this is a cartoon from a political journal, and the caption says there, as you can see, the Jew likes to play the butcher. For his pleasure, he wallows in meat, and there is the meat and the blood, right? And even the word kosher is written in Hebrew. The campaign was more intense, more organised, and more long-lived in Germany than anywhere else, and it's to get rid of kosher slaughter. Of course, the charges of animal cruelty rang hollow, considering contemporary non-Jewish modes of slaughter, which included techniques such as these. These are from trade magazines, right, from abattoir trade magazines, from butchery. So Regner's slaughter machine, which speaks for itself. Or this one, Arthur Stoff, a company in Erfurt, with this sort of bolt apparatus. And finally, this one, it's called the Bruno slaughter mask. What is noteworthy, however, about Germany is the failure of the campaign against kosher slaughter. From the 1880s time and again it met with defeat, thanks to the lobbying efforts of Jews and their allies in the Reichstag, the parliament, liberals, social democrats, and the Catholic Centre Party above all of whom grounded their opposition to the anti-Semites upon Germany's constitutional guarantee of religious freedom. I would just also tell you, reading the protocols of the Reichstag debates, they have the time that discussions begin and end. And there were discussions about kosher slaughter that went on for 4 and 5 hours at sessions. It's just a remarkable thing. I mean, it's just really very. It was shocking to read the times of the start time and the end time. Such was the case for years that their efforts failed. However, beginning around 1925, with Nazis now sitting in state parliaments, they took up the losing cause again and began to enjoy success at the state level. Still, the goal had always been a national ban, and after Hitler became Chancellor, the opponents of kosher slaughter did not have to wait long. The ban on the slaughter of animals without prior stunning was decreed on April the 21st, 1933. It's a measure of how important the banning of kosher slaughter was that it came a mere 11 weeks after Hitler assumed power. You'd think he had other things to do. The passage of such a law should have been the end of the matter. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because as a performative rite, kosher animal slaughter was tailor-made for Nazi propaganda. Not only was it deemed inhuman and radically un-German, but it could also be depicted graphically and in especially lurid ways. There was no one more enthusiastic about bombarding Germans with indelibly grotesque images of kosher slaughter than Julius Streicher, the most notorious anti-Semitic publisher in Germany. The images were seen by huge numbers of Germans. By 1938, his newspaper, Der Stürmer, reached its peak circulation of about 476,000 copies per week. This is an ad, not from the paper, but an ad for an upcoming issue. It says, "Protect yourself against Jewish exploitation." That's from 1935. And we see typically sort of anti-Semitic representations of Jewish man and his wife in their butcher shop, their blood-stained aprons. It's dirty. Interestingly, there's Hebrew here. And it says today, prime Treifer, Hackfleisch, like chopped meat. And then he says to his wife here, "What do you want a cat for? Just get me a rat. Just get me a rat, and I'll make mincemeat from it." The goy eats everything, especially if it's cheap. And there you can see him putting a rat into a meat grinder. Streicher also published wildly successful children's books with meat-related images. Now let's just go through some of these. So this is an infamous children's book from 1938 called Giftpilz, the Poisonous Mushroom. And it's the story of how you tell a poisonous mushroom, a toadstool from a mushroom. So it's an instruction book for children. But in it, we see this. And the caption is, "How Jews torment animals. The animal fell once more to the ground. Slowly it died. The Jews stood around and laughed." And there you see 2 horrified little German children looking in this basement. And this is the inspiration for this particular picture is that very first one that I showed you from the 18th century, which is a completely, non-tendentious depiction, in fact, quite a lovely depiction of the abattoir. But here you see the same sort of thing, and with them gathered around. Elvira Bauer was a 19-year-old school teacher. We don't know what happened to her. She disappeared, but she's remembered for having written one of the most outrageously anti-Semitic children's books. "Trust no fox on his green heath and no Jew on his oath." It's a play on something that Luther said. In addition to to meat itself as a theme. One of the other themes in the modern German Jewish story that I'm telling is the relationship of Germans to the Jewish cattle dealer. The Jewish cattle dealer was a very common figure on the social and economic landscape of rural Germany from the Middle Ages, really, but up until sort of into the Weimar Republic. And here you can just see the self-satisfied cattle dealer who's ripped off this, it's always the innocent German farmer who didn't know what hit him, and he's making off with, in kind with the cows and the pigs and the geese. This is a particularly interesting one. So he calls it once a Jew, always a Jew. Now, this is Ephraim Itzig, this guy here. He is, and you see there's a priest here who comes in, and it is a Friday. And you can see here. And he's shocked to see that Ephraim Itzig on a Friday is eating meat. He's eating a goose. So let me just, I translated this, but I haven't committed it to memory. What you see upon my table, it is no goose. It is just a fish. I bought myself a gosling and wanted to christen this tasty dish. On this roast I pronounced, you were a goose, you are now a fish. Now children, take a look at the Jew. Do you think that he can change and be just like you? When he has been baptized, 5 buckets of water over the crown of his head, yet nothing about him is changed anew. Once a Jew, always a Jew. And this is another one, the Jewish butcher, and it's this depiction of this butcher who's, again covered in blood, and with his really filthy butcher shop. There's blood dripping here. There's cats eating. He's not clean shaven. He's ready, smoking his cigar, and it's juxtaposed by these sort of fresh-faced Aryans, mother and child, spick and span and clean. But bearing in mind that this is a children's book. Finally, in this, Goebbels made a film in 1940 called The Eternal Jew. And it's a hideous film where Jews are depicted as rats. And there are just thousands of rats in this film. And this is and the film goes for exactly 1 hour. The scene of kosher slaughter runs for a full 7 minutes, which is a very long time in the context of a film that runs only for 1 hour. And it begins with them coming in to slaughter the cow with this theatrical parade of holding up the chalaf, right, as they march in to kill their killers. This, where it takes place, is in the Lodz ghetto. That's where this was filmed, and they were made to sort of enact the slaughter scene. It wasn't just animal slaughter, but the heavy representation of Jews in rural Germany as cattle dealers, as I just mentioned, is also the stuff of Nazi propaganda and ridicule. So here, this is a Jewish cattle dealer from the Black Forest region in the 1920s, and that's how he looked. This is Carnival in Mannheim in 1939, where you have this German walking down the street with a fake beard, money coming out of his top pocket, and he is playing the role of the cattle dealer in this carnival parade. And there's a sort of a close-up, and you can see, and people are laughing. I mean, this comes at a point in in Nazi anti-Semitism before the war, where anti-Semitism becomes ritualized and becomes a form of entertainment. And we often see crowds, and also look at this, you'll see it's raining this day, there are umbrellas. It doesn't deter the crowds from being there, and they're smiling and laughing and having a good time. We don't have to look at him anymore. There's much more to this story, than Jews and meat in Nazi Germany. Richard Walter Darré was Nazi Minister of Agriculture and peasant leader and chief ideologist of the regime's blood and soil doctrine. During his agricultural studies, he became convinced that in the cultural and natural history of mankind, there was a connection between certain human races and certain domestic animal species. In 1927, he published an essay, an article, called The Pig as a Criterion for Nordic People and Semites. Predictably, he speaks of the cultural and agri-racial affinity between Nordic peoples and pigs, both of which he said enjoyed a settled way of life and were unsuited to a nomadic existence. The Jews, being nomadic, were not only averse to pigs, but they had also codified their hatred of them with the dietary laws. Now, that background is important to what follows 10 years later. In 1937, Darré published a book entitled Der Schweinemord, The Massacre of the Pigs, or the thesis of which is as follows. Back in 1914, and this part is true, there was an early frost, fertilizer shortages, and no access to imported fodder, which led German farmers to illegally feed potatoes and grain to their animals. Those crops, potatoes and grain, were the dietary staples of the German poor. In response to the looming food crisis, the government put together the Elsbacher Commission, a panel of experts charged with drafting a plan for food production and consumption during World War I. Led by the Berlin professor Paul Elsbacher, the Commission's report identified pigs as co-eaters, Mitfresser, who competed with humans for valuable food. Experts calculated that the number of potatoes it took to feed 10 million pigs could feed 64 million Germans. As such, the Elsbacher Commission called for the slaughter of between 9 and 10 million pigs, and so it came to pass. For Darré, the Great Pig Massacre was not a consequence of bureaucratic incompetency as almost everybody saw it. Rather, it was the product of a deliberate Jewish conspiracy. The evidence, well, given what Darré had long believed about Aryans, Jews and pigs, it stood to reason that there had been a porcine genocide, given that Elsbacher and other members of the commission were Jewish. After all, in 1914, Elsbacher had declared, "Today, pigs are our greatest enemy." Darré read Elsbacher's declaration as a criminal confession and considered the commission named after him as little more than a gathering of the elders of Zion, plotting to starve Germans to death by denying them pork, their favourite meat. And pork runs as a red thread through this story, of course. From the perspective of Jewish life in Nazi Germany, as soon as the April 1933 ban on kosher slaughter went into effect, hundreds of kosher butchers lost their jobs, hundreds of kosher butcher shops shut down. Desperate advertisements appear in the Orthodox press from butchers looking for work. Until 1938, Jews were permitted to buy kosher meat from Holland or from Denmark. After that date, it was no longer permissible. Surreptitiously, there was a lot of illicit kosher slaughter, especially poultry, but red meat was almost impossible to come by. The community was especially distressed about the fate of the elderly and the sick, because at this time medical science, popular culture as well, considered meat to be the most important and irreplaceable source of protein. This led to the invention of a new term in the German Jewish religious lexicon, and that term was new kosher. New kosher was meat from animals that had been stunned by the brand new method of electronarcosis, following which their throats were immediately slit. This generated a significant halachic Jewish legal discussion in Germany as to whether this could be eaten. For some residents of Jewish nursing homes or patients in hospitals who kept kosher, it was an acceptable answer. We can eat that. To the Orthodox establishment, new kosher was merely old treif, as they announced in their repeated public warnings. In real terms, the denial of meat contributed to the deliberate policy of fostering hunger among Jews, which later became a policy of starvation. In symbolic terms, Meat eating was a daily habit and symbol of their bourgeois lives and culture. It was yet another thing stolen from German Jewry. Now let me conclude. For Christians and Jews in Germany, but especially for Jews, at the level of daily life, meat was extremely important as a source of nourishment, as both a symbol and fact of religious distinctiveness, as a trigger for nostalgic reflection, as inspiration for historical and scholarly interest, as a marker of middle-class tastes and aspirations, and as a special expression of Germanness in both an Aryan and a kosher key. To bring the story to a conclusion and closer to our time, the heirs of those forces that once led the fight against kosher slaughter today have their sights trained on halal slaughter. When they began to settle in Germany in the 1960s, Muslims, by and large, bought kosher meat. In 1979, the Berlin Administrative Court recognized the right of Muslims to perform halal slaughter. However, with the growth of Germany's Muslim population, their religious customs came under greater scrutiny and attitudes to halal slaughter began to harden. In 1982, a German meat company applied for an exemption from stunning animals prior to slaughter. Their petition explicitly sought parity with kosher slaughter. The court's judgment was as surprising as it was ironic. I would have said chutzpahdik, but okay, for the sake of scholarship, I'll say surprising and ironic. And this is the judgment from the court, from the bench. The permission for Jews to slaughter represents an act of political, cultural, and humanitarian compensation to the Jews who are still alive. The Jewish religion has in Germany a greater historical tradition than that of the Muslims. Jews have more or less integrated into the German people as Germans with essentially the same rights and duties. Other courts followed suit, arguing that where Muslim religious practices were foreign, Germany was a Judeo-Christian country and Jews had lived there for centuries, hence Jewish slaughter practices were as good as native to the land. There is no other food like meat. Reactions to it can be visceral. With other foods, one either likes them or not, can tolerate them or not. Meat is different. Inanimate as it is, it nonetheless has character and personality because it came from living creatures that we killed to get it. Studying Germans, Jews, and their respective understanding of meat and its many meanings, we're provided via a single commodity with a unique and revealing way of approaching the rich, fraught, and ultimately tragic history of German Jewry. In the end, we may paraphrase Mary Douglas and assert that the story I've told you is about the way Germans and Jews always confronted each other face to face, but never more so than at the division of the meat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for a wonderful talk. John's happy to take questions. Just can you introduce yourself when I give you the microphone?
Hi, I'm Avi, and I always like asking the first question.
I'm sorry?
And I always like asking the first question.
Oh, okay.
I work in letters and science on campus. Can you give a little comment about the social position or the class issues around the occupation of being a butcher? I'm asking because we had a speaker in the Townsend Center earlier this week, who an Algerian, who said that in Algeria the position of butchers was similar to the position of craftspeople, like jewelry makers or blacksmiths. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what was the position of Jewish butchers in the class system in Germany? And then also, were there any issues around land ownership here? Because I'm assuming that the butchers were either buying, as you say, cattle from dealers who, the dealers owned the farms. The Jews did not own the farms or own the land, similar to the dairy situation. And at what point in urbanization do people switch from, just like with bread, bringing your loaves to a central baker and having them baked, do they switch to bringing animals that you own to have someone else butcher them to buying the meat directly from the people who are butchering them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the social status of the butcher is not particularly high. It never is. In the Middle Ages, and this is actually begin the book with a discussion. It's called the first chapter is called The Jewish Butcher's Tale, and it is about one of the things that it's about is the social status of the butcher. The butcher is, the third and lowest level of community member. Okay, but it's ironic that, unlike with any other position, the community places their complete trust in someone to whom they accord very little honour. They're completely dependent on the butcher saying that, you're selling this as saying that it's kosher, that there's nothing wrong with it, that it's not blemished in any way, shape or form. It doesn't change the fact that he's sort of on the lowest rung of the social scale within the community, but he enjoys a position of trust. He has some learning, as is required by law, and he has skills that no one else in the community has. So by the time we get to the modern period, there are a lot of butchers, Jewish butchers in Germany. Not everyone is middle class. I mean, there is an image of German Jewry as being overwhelmingly middle class. But even the working class Jews in Germany have middle class sort of aspirations or an outlook. There are butcher shops all over Germany, as I mentioned. They're targeted early on, and there's no one to really assist or help them. And they lose their jobs very, very quickly, right? The Germans threw Jews out of civil service on April the 7th, 1933. There was a purge of the civil service of all Jews from the civil service, right? Thousands of Jews lost their jobs overnight. And this weren't as many butchers as there were Jewish civil servants, but all of them immediately sort of were rendered into poverty. So, but at that particular point, they're sort of on their own. Now, there's a whole thing about the Jewish butcher. In the late 19th century in Germany, there are still many village Jews in Germany. Not everyone's living in Berlin, But none of these, and the communities tend to be traditional and need kosher meat, but none of these communities could support the existence of a kosher butcher shop. So we have something very interesting in Germany where Christian butchers sell kosher meat. They set aside part of their shop and they work together with the kosher butcher, but who can't own a store, the shochet actually. And so we have this form of cooperation, which is, over the one object, the one commodity that is designed. It is designed to socially separate Jews from their non-Jewish neighbours. It brings them together. So this act of cooperation is very important. One other thing about these small communities, there is a phenomenon in the late 19th century in Germany where lay people become interested in learning how to be a shochet. They have no idea how to do it. They get training, and we see another new literary genre in Germany that doesn't appear anywhere else. We have Schritter manuals, kosher slaughter manuals, that are written in German because they couldn't read them in Hebrew. So these lay people were itinerant shochtim. They went around the countryside to slaughter animals for these traditional Jewish communities in very small rural areas. So there's a whole story of the Jewish butcher that manifests itself in all sorts of different ways from late 19th century. So they themselves are interested. They want to serve the community, but they can't read the Hebrew manuals. Oh, and by the way, just one other thing about the medieval period, the Shchita manuals of one particular rabbi, Jacob Weil, which was written in about 1470 or something like that, becomes the kind of gold standard and still remains essentially, by and large, the instruction manual for the way Ashkenazic Jews slaughter animals to this very day. So from the Jewish perspective, Germany, contributes something that is very, very long-standing and of great importance to the whole culture of meat.
There's another question here.
Yes, I just wanted to add the other side of the Christian butcher is my paternal grandfather in a small town in Bohemia was a butcher. Yeah. And the store was divided with a wall. One side was kosher for the Jews, where he employed a Jewish person to sell it, and the other one was for the non-Jews, where he had all the meats that they ate, and he felt that that's how you do business.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take the, all right, I see Shane up. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair for a second to ask my own question. I'm persuaded, I think we all are persuaded of the importance of meat in the story that you tell and the story of Jews and Christians in Germany. I guess the sort of question that I want you to maybe just speculate a little bit about is, why do you think meat in particular has such significance? And I guess, one issue that I didn't hear you bring up, but that resonates partly from your other scholarship, is about meat and corporeality, whether you think that plays a role. And then the other question that I thought about was whether you think the importance of the catechism in another set of religious disputes in Germany and elsewhere, in Christian Europe, has any role in terms of how meat is thought about with regard to Jews and Christians.
I didn't quite get the last point.
The catechism. I mean, the question of, the host and all ideas about desecration of the host and ideas about the body of Christ and
transubstantiation.
That's it. Okay.
It's a pretty big book, and so it's a little frustrating that I don't have an answer to that question. Why Germany? Why Germany? I hinted at it when I began to speak about Michaelis in the 18th century. And it has to do with, I think it has to do with the anthropological nature of citizenship, of ethnicity, which the fact that Germany in the 18th century is not a nation state, it comes very late to the party. Germany only becomes a nation in 1871. Interestingly, the Jews are emancipated in 1871. So Germany, unlike in France, unlike in England, one of the ways to define oneself as a German, what makes you a German, that you wouldn't hear in these other countries, is I'm a German because I'm not a Jew. Right? So the formation of the German nation and the integration of Jews has a very, has a sort of a, as I say, anthropological, ethnic quality to it from very early on. And it leads them to focus on things like, internal Jewish culture in a way that, as to whether it can be set aside. So there were plenty of people in the 18th century. Christian Wilhelm Daum was a Prussian bureaucrat who argued for the emancipation of the Jews. The Jew is more man than Jew, is what he said. If they're treated well, they will reciprocate in kind. But there were also, Michaelis represents, in his first thing in 1782, his was a response to Moses Mendelssohn, actually, in which he told Mendelssohn, because of these reasons. And nowhere else. So there's a huge debate in France, the time of the revolution, about the emancipation debates. And they discuss everything about Jews, but they don't mention meat. It only exists there. So that's as close as I can come to an answer, Ethan.
Thank you. Shana, you had a question?
It's another kind of comparative question. I mean, I was fascinated by the cattle dealer.
Yeah.
Is that culturally specific to Germany? I mean,
And Switzerland.
and Switzerland, but it wasn't. There was no cattle dealer in East European history.
No, not like this. No,
Right, not
no,
that
no.
served
no.
the mainstream community and the Jewish
Precisely,
community.
precisely.
Right.
And they, you know, they're a very interesting group. They had their own patois. They had their own language called Lachudish, which is from Lashon Kodesh. And there are manuals that, with glossaries of all of the terms that they use, sort of hundreds of terms, sort of basically this sort of mixture of Hebrew and German. So they have their own culture, and they're very well integrated into the countryside. The Nazis had some trouble, actually, turning non-Jewish cattle dealers against the Jewish cattle dealers, because there's the nature of the business is one of trust and personal relationships. It's not a sort of an anonymous kind of transactional occupation. And that trust had been built up for many, many years. And so the Nazis really had to work at prying the two parties apart. They were successful in the end, of course. But and the other thing is that the highest concentration of Jewish cattle dealers happened to be in the part of Germany that Julius Streicher was the Gauleiter. So in Der Stürmer, there is just hundreds. I mean, he started publishing in 1922, I think, 22 till 45. Hundreds of articles in which he reports on court cases where the Jewish butcher has been accused of a sexual crime. The sexual crime being having slept with a German woman, right? Perpetrating what was called Rassenschande, right? Racial defilement, which was against the Nuremberg laws, of course. And he took delight in, but it was always the butcher who was the focus of this. And it's just one story after another. Every issue is full of these particular things. And certainly it has something to do with the fact that the heaviest concentration of these Jewish cattle dealers was in his district.
Okay, I think we now we have a whole bevy of questions as we're nearing the end of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these three questions that I saw. We'll take them together. John, you can take a minute and respond to whatever you wish.
Hi, I'm curious. The arc that you've described. Okay, sorry.
I can hear you.
The arc that you've described of how Germans perceived Jewish slaughtering rituals and handling of meat, is that in any way correlated with a rise or fall in perceptions of the blood libel in popular imagination in the areas that you studied?
So,
Sorry.
Oh.
Just in the interest of time, we're going to take them all together.
Okay.
So.
Okay, I've got to write this down. Okay.
Sure. Okay. There was one over here.
You gave such great information about the Jewish bourgeois relationship to meat, and I was wondering, among the Jewish bourgeoisie who maybe weren't very traditionally observant or were partially assimilating, which dietary laws tended to go first? And did some people, while not maintaining most of the dietary laws, keep some central ones like not eating pork?
Well, there's nothing in the source. I mean, one would have. there are lots of degrees of kosher, right? And people make up their own. Right. So some people will eat treif, but not in the house, right? They'll eat out. They'll eat pork, but they won't eat shellfish. They'll eat shellfish, but they won't eat pork. I mean, it's just, so all of this happened in Germany. So in that respect, the attitude and the positions that were adopted are not entirely different from what one would find today. So that's what I would say about it. It's a broad spectrum of personal decisions. But meat is very important. There's one passage in the book where the great and very important diarist Victor Klemperer kept a diary in Dresden during the war. He was married to a non-Jewish woman, so he lived with a yellow badge. He wasn't deported, but he had to live there. And in one of the diaries, in one of his memoirs, there's 3 volumes actually of the diaries covering the span of his life. His father had been a rabbi, and Victor Klemperer converts, but he talks about the time where his father went for a job interview, got the job. He'd been a rabbi in sort of East Prussia, which is sort of Poland essentially. Today it's Poland. Served that community, even though he was not of that ilk, but he nonetheless, a job is a job, so he served that community. Anyway, Klemperer has a long description of the first time that he ate treif, in which his mother took him to a butcher shop, and they walked past the butcher shop that they normally go to with the Hebrew writing on the window, and they went to a non-kosher butcher shop, and the mother sort of looks around and then orders the various kinds of Wurst, sausage, and then takes it back home. The father is not there. Not that he may not have objected, but they took advantage while the cat's away. She tucked into it first, and she said, "This is what the others eat." And this was a major moment for him. And of course, Victor Klemperer, his one comment was, "That tastes exactly the same as ours." Right? The kosher Wurst. So, but anyway, that's a real moment. The moment that you cross a Rubicon like that, where you eat treif for the very first time, and we have testimony to that effect, is a very significant moment. Meat is, it's just another thing about the power of meat, that, there's no hierarchy of treif, right? There's just no hierarchy of treif. There's no distinction. Pork is not more treif than a steak that's just not kosher. There's no difference. But it has a completely different impact. You can have a piece of non-kosher cheese, but no one's going to get too excited about it. A person who's orthopractic won't eat it, but if they do eat it, if they were to say, I'm going to eat this, that's not the moment where you cross the sort of culinary Rubicon. But meat, and particularly if it's going to be pork sausage, that's a whole other thing. And it takes you into a sort of a different realm psychologically, culturally. You're leaving something behind in a very profound way and entering through a portal into a different world altogether. So.
Well, this really gives us a sense of the remarkable range of John, and undoubtedly of this book.
So all I would say...
And it's just a taste.
A taste. Well, what I would say is,
Unintended.
as Pesach is upon us, for those of you who celebrate Pesach, I wish you a happy Pesach, and may your brisket turn out well. That's all I can say.
And there are books for sale in the corner, and so encourage people to take a look and consider getting a copy.